"Lads," he commanded, and as if on cue, as though they'd been awaiting their chance, several men loyal to Calico Jack stepped forward with drawn weapons. We were outnumbered, but that didn't stop Adewale, about to draw his cutlass, only to feel the full weight of a guard across his face, which sent him crumpling to the deck. I found myself with a face full of pistol barrels when I moved forward to help. "See, the boys and I had a bit of a council while you were wasting time with this lot," said Calico Jack, indicating the captured slaver, "and they figured I'd be a fitter captain than you reckless dogs." He gestured towards Adewale, and my blood rose as he said, "This one I figure I may sell for a tenner in Kingston. But with you two, I can't take any chances." Surrounded, me, Charles, and our men were helpless to do anything. My mind reeled, wondering where it had all gone so wrong. Had we needed Blackbeard that much? Did we rely on him so heavily that things could go so terribly awry in his absence? It seemed so. It seemed so. "You'll regret this day, Rackham," I hissed. "I regret most of them already," sighed the mutineer Calico Jack. His colourful Indian shirt was the last thing I saw, as another man came forward clutching a black bag that he pulled over my head. 47. And that was how we found ourselves marooned on Providencia, after a month adrift on the damaged Ranger, that was. Jack had left us food and weapons, but we had no means of steering or sailing the ship, so it was a month at sea in which we tried and failed to repair the broken rigging and masts, and spent most of the day manning the pumps in order to stay afloat. A month in which I'd had to listen to Vane ranting and raving all hours of the day and night. Shaking his fist at thin air, he was. "I'll get you, Jack Rackham! I'll open you up! I'll tear out your organs and string a bloody lute with them!" We spent Christmas 1718 on the Ranger, bobbing around like a discarded liquor bottle on the waves, praying for mercy from the weather. Just me and him. And of course we had no calendars or such, so it was impossible to say when Christmas fell, or which day 1718 became 1719. But I'm prepared to wager I spent them listening to Charles Vane rage at the sea, at the sky, at me, and especially at his old mucker Calico Jack Rackham. "I'll get you! You see if I don't, you scurvy bastard!" And when I tried to remonstrate with him, hinting that perhaps his constant shouting was doing more harm to our morale than good, he turned on me. "Well, well, the fearsome Edward Kenway speaks," he'd bawl. "Pray tell us, Captain, how to quit this predicament, and tell us what genius you have for sailing a boat with no sails and no rudder." How we didn't kill each other during that time I'll never know, but by God we were glad to see land. We hooted with pleasure, clasped each other, jumped up and down. We launched a yawl from the stricken Ranger, and as night fell we rowed ashore, then collapsed on the beach, exhausted but ecstatic that after a month drifting at sea we'd finally found land. The next morning we awoke to find the Ranger wrecked against the beach, and cursed one another for failing to drop anchor. And then cursed our luck as we realised just how small it was, the island on which we were now marooned. Providencia, it was called. A small island with its fair share of history. A bloody history at that. English colonists, pirates, and the Spanish had done nothing but fight over it for the best part of a century. 40 years ago, the great pirate Captain Henry Morgan had set his cap at it, recaptured it from the Spanish, and used it as his base for a while. By the time Vane and I set down upon the island, it was home to a few colonists, escaped slaves, and convicts, and the remnants of the Mosquito Indians who were native to it. You could explore the abandoned fort, but there was nothing much left. Nothing you could eat or drink, anyway. And you could swim across the Santa Catalina, but then that was even smaller. so mainly we spent the days fishing and finding frond oysters in small pools, and occasionally having a kind of snarling standoff with groups of passing natives, ragged, wandering colonists, or turtle fishermen. The colonists in particular always wore a wild, frightened look, as though they weren't sure whether to attack or run away, and could just as well do either. Their eyes seemed to swivel in their sockets in different directions at once, and they made odd twitchy movements with dry, sun-parched lips. I turned to Charles Vane after one particular encounter, about to comment, and saw that he too was wearing a wild look, and his eyes seemed to swivel in their sockets, and he made odd twitchy movements with his dry, sun-parched lips. Until whatever fragile cord holding Charles Vane together snapped one day, and off he went to start a new Providencia tribe, a tribe of one. I should have tried to talk him out of it. Charles, we must stick together. But I was sick to the back teeth of Charles Vane, and anyway it wasn't like I'd seen the last of him. He took to stealing my oysters for a start, scuttling out of the jungle, hairy and unshaven, his clothes ragged and with the look of the madman in his eyes. He'd scoop up my just-caught frond oysters, curse me for a bastard, then scuttle back into the undergrowth from which he would curse me some more. My days were spent on the beach, swimming, fishing, or scanning the horizon for vessels, all the time knowing full well he was tracking me from within the undergrowth. On one occasion I tried to remonstrate with him. "Will you talk with me, Vane? Are you fixed on this madness?" "Madness?" he responded. "Ain't nothing mad about a man fighting to survive, is there?" "I mean you no harm, you corker. Let's work this out like gentlemen." "Ah, God, I've a bleeding headache on account of our jabbering. Now stay back and let me live in peace." "I would if you'd stop filching the food I gather and the water I find." "I'll stop nothing till you paid me back in blood. You's the reason we were out looking for slavers. You's the reason Jack Rackham took my ship." You see what I had to contend with? He was losing his mind. He blamed me for things that were plainly his own fault. It was he who had suggested we go after the observatory. It was he who'd caused our current predicament by killing the slaver captain. I had as much reason to hate him as he had to despise me. The difference between us was that I hadn't lost my mind. At least not yet, anyway. He was doing his best to remedy that, it seemed. He got crazier and crazier. "You and your fairy stories got us into this mess, Kenway." He stayed in the bushes like a rodent in a darkened undergrowth, curled up in roots, with his arms round tree trunks, crouched in his own stink, and watching me with craven eyes. It began to occur to me that Vane might try to kill me. I kept my blades clean, and though I didn't wear them, I'd become accustomed to wearing very little. I kept them close at hand. Before I knew it, he graduated from being a madman ranting at me from within the undergrowth to leaving traps for me. Until one day I decided I'd had enough. I had to kill Charles Vane. The morning that I set out to do it, it was with a heavy heart. I wondered whether it was better to have a madman as a companion than no companion at all. For he was a madman who hated me, and who probably wanted to kill me. It was either him or me. I found him in a water hole, sitting crouched with his hands between his legs, trying to make a fire and singing to himself, some nonsense song. His back was to me, offering me an easy kill, and I tried to tell myself I was being humane by putting him out of his misery, as I approached stealthily and activated my blade. But I couldn't help myself. I hesitated, and in that moment he sprang his trap, flinging out one arm and tossing hot ashes into my face. As I reeled back, he jumped to his feet, cutlass in hand, and the battle was on. Attack, parry, attack. I used my blade as a sword, meeting his steel and replying with my own. and I wondered, did he think of me as betraying him? Probably. His hatred gave him strength, and for some moments he was no longer the pathetic troglodyte he had become. The fight returned to his eye. But it was not enough to turn the battle. The weeks spent crouching in the undergrowth and feeding off what he could steal had weakened him, and I disarmed him easily. Instead of killing him then, I sheathed my blade, unstrapped it, and tossed it away, tearing off my shirt at the same time, and we fought with fists, stripped to the waist. Then, when I had him down and pummeled him, I caught myself and stopped. I stood, breathing heavily, with blood dripping from my fists. Below me on the ground, Charles Vane, this unkempt, hermit-looking man. And of course I stank myself, but I wasn't as bad as him. I could smell the shit I saw dried on his thighs as he half rolled on the ground and spat out a tooth on a thin string of saliva, chuckling to himself like a madman. "You Nancy boy," he said. "You've only done half the job." I shook my head. "Is this my reward for believing the best about men? For thinking a bilge rat like you could muster up some sense once in a while?" Maybe Hornigold was right. Maybe the world does need men of ambition to stop the likes of you from messing it all up. Charles laughed. "Or maybe you just don't have the stones to live with no regrets." I spat. "Don't save me a spot in hell, shanker. I ain't coming soon." And then I left him there, and when later I was able to help myself to a fisherman's boat, I wondered whether to go and fetch him, but decided against. God forgive me, but I'd had just about all I could take of Charles bloody Vane. 48. May 1719. I arrived home to Inagua after months away, thankful to be alive and glad to see my crew. Even more when I saw how pleased they were to see me. "He's alive! The captain is alive!" They celebrated for days, drank the bay dry, and it gladdened the heart to see. Mary was there too, but dressed as James Kidd, so I banished all thoughts of her bosoms, called her James when others were present, even Adewale, who rarely left my side when I first returned, as though not wanting to let me out of his sight. Meanwhile, Mary had news of my confederates. Stede Bonnet had been hanged at White Point. Poor old Stede. My merchant friend, who evidently changed his mind where pirates were concerned, so much so he'd taken up the life himself. The gentleman pirate, they had called him. He'd worn a dressing gown and worked the routes further north for a while, before meeting Blackbeard on his travels. The pair had teamed up, but because Bonnet was as bad a pirate captain as he was a sailor, which is to say, a very bad pirate captain, his crew had mutinied and joined Blackbeard. For Bonnet, the final insult was that he had to remain as a guest on Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. Well, not the final insult, obviously. The final insult was being caught and hanged. Meanwhile, on Nassau, poor, ailing Nassau, James Bonny was spying for Woodes Rogers, bringing more shame upon Anne than her roving eye ever had upon him, while Rogers had struck a mortal blow to the pirates. In a show of strength, he'd ordered 8 of them be hanged on Nassau harbour, and since then his opposition had crumbled. Even a plot to kill him had been half-hearted and easily overthrown. And, joy of joys, Calico Jack had been captured and the jackdaw recovered. Turned out the liquor had got the better of Jack. Privateers commissioned by Jamaica's governor had caught up with him south of Cuba. Jack and his men had gone ashore and were sleeping off the booze under tents when the privateers arrived, so they fled into the jungle and the jackdaw was recovered. Since then the scurvy dog had crawled back to Nassau, where he persuaded Rogers to give him a pardon, and was hanging around the taverns selling stolen watches and stockings. "So what now?" said Mary, having delivered her news. "Still chasing your elusive fortune?" "Aye, and I'm close. I've heard the Sage is sailing out of Kingston on a ship called the Princess. James had stood and was beginning to walk away, headed for the port. Put your ambition to better use, Kenway. Find the Sage with us. The assassin, she meant, of course. There was silence when I thought about them. I've no stomach for you and your mystics, Mary. I want a taste of the good life. An easy life. She shook her head and began to walk away. Over her shoulder she said, No one honest has an easy life, Edward. It's aching for one that causes the most pain. If the Princess was sailing out of Kingston, then Kingston was where I needed to be. And my God, Kingston was beautiful. It had grown from a refugee camp into the largest town in Jamaica, which isn't to say it was an especially large town, just the largest in Jamaica. The buildings new yet ramshackle looking, overlooked by hills populated by beautiful greenery, and caressed by a cool sea breeze that rolled off Port Royal and took some of the sting out of a blistering sun. Just some of it, mind, just some of it. I loved it. In Kingston I'd look around and wonder if Nassau could have been this way, if we'd stuck at it, if we hadn't allowed ourselves to be so easily corrupted. The sea was the clearest blue, and it seemed to glitter and hold aloft the ships that were anchored in the bay. For a moment, as I gasped at the beauty of the sea and was reminded of the treasures it held, I thought of Bristol. How I'd stood on the harbour there and looked out to the ocean, dreaming of riches and adventure. The adventure I'd found. The riches? Well, the Jackdaw hadn't lain completely dormant during my time on Providencia. They'd taken some prizes. Added to what I already had in my coffers, I wasn't rich exactly, but neither was I poor. Perhaps I was, finally, a man of means. But if I could just find the observatory. Greed, you see, my sweet. It's the undoing of many a man. Tethered at the quay were rowing boats, dandies and yawls, but it wasn't those I was interested in. I stopped and held a spyglass to my eye, scanning the horizon for signs of a slaver, the Princess, stopping to relish the glorious sight of the Jackdaw, then continued. Citizens and traders bustled past, all wares for sale, and soldiers too. Spaniards with their blue tunics and tricorns, muskets over their shoulders. A pair of them passed, looking bored and gossiping. What's all this fuss about here? Everyone's got sticks shoved well up their arses today. Aye, we're on alert because of some visiting Spaniard, Toreador or Torres or something. So he was here. Him and Rogers. Did they know about the Sage on the Princess too? And then something that struck me as very interesting indeed, when I overheard a soldier say, Do you know what I heard? Governor Rogers and Captain Hornigold are part of a secret society. A secret order made up of Frenchies and Spaniards and Italians and even some Turks. Templars, I was thinking, even as I caught sight of Adewale beckoning to me. He stood with a sweaty, nervous-looking sailor, who was introduced as working for the Royal Africa Company, a Jack Tar persuaded to talk with a surreptitious dagger in his ribs. Tell him what you told me, said Adewale. The merchant looked uncomfortable, as you would, I suppose. I haven't seen the Princess for 8 weeks or more, he said, meaning she may soon be back. We let him go and I mulled over the news. The Princess wasn't here. Yet. We could stay, I decided. Bring the men ashore, make sure they behaved themselves, try not to attract too much attention. Adewale pulled me to one side. I grow tired of chasing these fantasies of yours, Edward, as does the crew. And that's all I need. Unrest in the bloody crew. Hang in there, man, I reassured him. We're getting close. Meanwhile, I had an idea. Find Rogers and Benjamin. By sticking close to the harbour I found them and began tailing them, remembering what I'd been taught by Mary. Staying out of sight and using the sense to listen to their conversation. "Have you alerted the men?" Woodes Rogers was saying. "We're short on time." "Aye," replied Hornigold. "There'll be 2 soldiers waiting for us at the crossroads." "Very good." Ah, a bodyguard. Now where might they be lurking? Not wanting to be taken by surprise, I glanced around. But by now Hornigold was speaking again. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, what's the meaning behind these blood samples we're taking?" "Torres tells me that blood is required for the observatory to properly function." "How do you mean, sir?" "If one wishes to use the observatory to, say, spy on King George, then one would require a drop of the king's blood to do so. In other words, a small sample of blood gives us access to a man's everyday life." Mumbo-jumbo. I paid it little mind at the time, but I'd regret that later. "Does Torres mean to spy on me, then?" Benjamin was saying, "for I've just given him a sample of my own blood." "As have I, Captain Hornigold, as will all Templars, as a measure of insurance." "And trust, I reckon." "Yes, but fear not. Torres has shipped our samples to a Templar safe house in Rio de Janeiro. We will not be the observatory's first subjects, I assure you." "Aye, sir. I suppose it's a small price to pay for what the Templars have given me in return." "Precisely. And that is when I met the bodyguards. Let's call them Brute Number 1 and Brute Number 2. "And what can we do for you?" Ah, I thought. So these are the 2 soldiers you were talking about. 49. Brute Number 1 is left-handed, but wants me to think he'll lead with his right. Brute Number 2 is not quite as combat proficient. Too relaxed. Thinks I'm easily beaten. "Now where would you be going?" said Number 1. "Because my friend and I have been watching you. And you'll have to forgive me for saying, Chief, but it looks awfully like you're following Mr. Rogers and Mr. Hornigold, and listening in on their conversation." The Mr. Rogers and Mr. Hornigold in question were oblivious to the work their guards were doing on their behalf. That was good. What wasn't quite so good was that they were moving off, and I still had much to learn. So get rid of these guys. The advantage I had was my hidden blade. It was strapped to my right hand. My sword hung on that side too, so I would reach for it with my left. An experienced swordsman would expect my attack to come from that side and would defend himself accordingly. Big Brute Number 1, he was an experienced swordsman. I could see by the way he planted one foot slightly in front of the other and angled his body side on, and yet when the time came, would quickly switch feet, feinting to take me from a different side. I knew that too. And that's because Big Brute Number 1 was expecting my sword to be drawn with my left hand. Neither knew I had a hidden blade which would sprout from my right. So we stared at one another. Mainly me and Big Brute Number 1. And then I made my move, right hand outstretched as though in protection, but then, engage blade, strike, and Brute Number 2 was still reaching for his own sword when my blade pierced his neck. At the same time I'd snatched my sword from my belt with my left hand, and was able to defend Big Brute Number 1's first attack, our swords clashing with the force of first impact. Big Brute Number 2 gurgled and died, the blood pumping through fingers he held to his own throat. And now we were on equal footing. I brandished blade and sword at Big Brute Number 1, and saw that the look he'd worn, a look of confidence, you might even say arrogance, had been replaced by fear. He should have run. I probably would have caught him, but he should have run anyway. Should have tried to warn his lords and masters that a man was following them. A dangerous man. A man with the skills of an assassin. But he didn't run. He stood and stayed to fight. and though he was a man of skill and he fought with more intelligence and more bravery than I was used to, it was that pride on the streets of Kingston with a crowd of people looking on, a pride he could not bear to sacrifice, that ultimately was his undoing. And when the end came, which it did, but only after a hard-fought battle, I made sure that for him the end was swift, his pain kept to a minimum. The bystanders shrank back as I made my escape, swallowed up by the docks, hoping to catch Rogers and Hornigold. I made it, arriving at a quayside and crouching beside two drunks at the harbour wall as they met another man, Laureano Torres. They greeted each other with nods of the head, supremely aware of their own importance. I ducked my head. Groan, had too much rum, as his gaze swept past where I sat, and then he delivered his news. The princess was taken by pirates 6 weeks ago, he said, and insofar as we know, the sage Roberts was still aboard. I cursed to myself. If only the men knew how close they'd been to a short holiday in Kingston. Now, though, we were going to have to hunt pirates. They started walking, and I stood and joined the crowds, following, invisible, using the sense, hearing everything they said. What of the sage's present location? Do we know? Asked Torres. Africa, Your Excellency, said Rogers. Africa? By God, the winds do not favour that route. I concur, Grand Master. I should have sailed there myself. One of my slave galleys would be more than capable of making a swift journey. Slave galley, said Torres, not happy. Captain, I asked you to divest yourself of that sick institution. I fail to see the difference between enslaving some men and all men, said Rogers. Our aim is to steer the entire course of civilization, is it not? A body enslaved inspires the mind to revolt, said Torres curtly. But enslave a man's mind, and his body will trot along naturally. Rogers conceded. A fair point, Grand Master. Now they'd reached the perimeter of the docks, where they stopped at the entrance to a dilapidated warehouse, watching the activities inside the open door. Men seemed to be disposing of bodies, either clearing them from the warehouse or putting them to one side, perhaps for loading onto a cart or ship, or, what was more likely, tipping them straight into the sea. Torres asked the question I wanted answered myself. What has happened here? Rogers smiled thinly. These were men who resisted our generous requests for blood. Pirates and privateers, mostly. Torres nodded. I see. I tightened at the thought, looked at the bodies, crooked arms and crooked legs, unseeing eyes. Men no different to me. I've been using my king's pardon as an excuse to collect samples from as many men as possible, said Rogers. And when they refuse, I hang them. All within the boundaries of my mandate, of course. Good. For if we cannot keep watch on all the world as scoundrels, then the seas should be rid of them entirely. Now they moved on, heading towards the gangplank of a ship moored nearby. I followed, darting behind a stack of crates to listen. Remind me, said Torres. Where in Africa are we looking? Principe, sir. A small island, said Hornigold. Torres and Rogers strode up the gangplank, but Hornigold hung back. Why? Why was he hanging back? And now I saw. With squinted eyes, the practised look of a seafarer, he scanned the horizon and studied the ships anchored like sentinels in the glittering ocean, and his eyes alighted on one ship in particular. And then with a lurch of shock I realized where we were. And where we were was within sight of the jackdaw. Hornigold tensed. His hand went to the hilt of his sword, and he turned round slowly. He was looking for me, I knew, guessing that wherever the jackdaw was, I wouldn't be far away. "Edward Kenway," he called out as his gaze passed around the docks. "Imagine my surprise at seeing your jackdaw anchored here. Have you heard all you came to hear? Will you now go and rescue the poor sage from our clutching hands?" In retrospect, it was a bit rash what I did next. I was unable to think of anything but the fact that Benjamin had been one of us, one of my mentors, a friend of Edward Thatch. And now he worked to try to destroy us. All of that bubbled to the surface in a rage as I emerged from behind the crates to face him. "A pox on you, traitor! You sold us down the river!" "Because I found a better path," said Hornigold. Instead of drawing his weapon, he signalled with his hand. From the warehouse behind I heard the sound of swords being drawn. Hornigold continued. "The Templars know order, discipline, structure. But you never could fathom these subtleties. Goodbye, old friend. You were a soldier once, when you fought for something real, something beyond yourself." He left, almost breaking into a run. From the warehouse came his reinforcements, and the men closed in behind him, forming a crescent around me. Taking them by surprise, I started quickly forward, grabbed the sailor who waved his sword to no particular effect, and span him, using him as a shield and pushing him forward so that his boots skidded on the harbour stone. At the same time there was the crack of a pistol, and my human shield took a musket ball that was meant for me, before I shoved him into the line of men and with my left hand snatched out my first pistol. I shot a heavy in the mouth, holstered it, and snatched my second at the same time as I engaged the blade and sliced open a third man's chest. Discharged the pistol. A wayward shot, it nevertheless did the job and stopped a man bearing a cutlass and sent him falling to the ground with his hands at his stomach. I crouched and whirled, taking the legs from beneath the next man, finished him with a quick and ruthless blade punch to the chest. Then I was on my feet, scattering the last two men, their faces portraits in terror, not wishing to join their comrades dead or bleeding on the harbour floor, and ran for my rowing boat and to get back to the jackdaw. And as I worked the oars to where my ship was moored, I could imagine the conversation with my quartermaster. How he'd remind me that the men didn't approve of my quest. They'd approve, though, once we found the observatory. Once we found the sage. And it took me a month. But I did. '50. July 1719. I found him on Principe one afternoon in a camp full of corpses. Now here's what I learnt about the sage, Bartholomew Roberts, some of which was later told to me by him, some by others. Firstly, we had something in common. We were both Welsh, me from Swansea, him from Casnewydd Bach, and that he had changed his name from John to Bartholomew, that he had gone to sea when he was just 13 as a carpenter, before finding himself an object of interest for this secret society known as the Templars. At the beginning of 1719, with the Templars and the assassins on his tail, the sage had found himself serving as a third mate on the Princess, just as I'd been told, under Captain Abraham Plum. As I'd learnt in Kingston, in early June, the Princess had been attacked by pirates in the Royal Rover and the Royal James, led by Captain Howell Davis. Somehow, Roberts, wily operator that he was, had inveigled himself in with Captain Howell Davis. He'd convinced the pirate captain, also a Welshman as it happens, that he was a superb navigator, which he may well have been, but he was also able to talk to Captain Davis in Welsh, which created a further bond between the two men. It was said that Bart Roberts was not keen on becoming a pirate at first, but as you'll see, he took to his new job like a duck to water. and then they landed on Principe. The Royal Rover this was, what with the Royal James having to be abandoned with worm damage. So the Royal Rover headed for Principe, and by hoisting British colours was allowed to dock, where the crew played the part of visiting English sailors. Now, according to what I heard, Captain Davis came up with a plan. His plan was to invite the governor of Principe on board the Rover on the pretext of giving him lunch, and then as soon as he was aboard, take him hostage and demand a huge ransom for his release. Perfect. Couldn't fail. But when Davis took men to meet the governor, they were ambushed at a camp along the way, which was where I came in. I crept into the camp, into the deserted scene of the ambush, where the fire had burned down to red embers, one man actually lying in the dying embers, his corpse slowly cooking. Scattered around were more bodies. Some were soldiers, some were pirates. "Captain Kenway," came a voice, and I span round to see him there. The sage. Perhaps I would have been pleased to see him. Perhaps I would have thought my journey was at an end, if he hadn't been pointing a gun at me. At the insistence of his gun barrel, I put my hands in the air. "Another dire situation, Roberts. We must stop meeting like this." He smiled grimly. Does he bear me any ill will, I wondered? He had no idea of my plans, after all. A crazy part of me realised that I wouldn't have been surprised if he could read minds. "Stop tailing me and your wish would come true," he said. "There's no need for this. You know I'm as good as my word." Around us the jungle was silent. Bartholomew Roberts seemed to be thinking. It was odd, I mused. Neither of us really had the measure of the other. Neither of us really knew what the other one wanted. I knew what I wanted from him, of course. But what about him? What did he want? I sensed that whatever it was, it would be more dark and more mysterious than I could possibly imagine. All I knew for sure was that death followed Bart Roberts, and I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. He spoke. "Our Captain Howell was killed today in a Portuguese ambush. Headstrong fool. I warned him not to come ashore." It was to the recently deceased captain that Bartholomew Roberts went now, evidently deciding I was not a threat as he holstered his pistol. And of course, the attack. I thought I knew who was behind it. "It was orchestrated by the Templars," I told him. "The same sort who took you to Havana." His long hair shook as he nodded, seeming to think at the same time. "I see now there is no escaping the Templars' attention, is there? I suppose it is time to fight back." Now you're talking, I thought. As we'd been speaking, I'd watched him peel off his sailor's rags and pull on first the breeches of the dead captain and then the shirt. The shirt was blood-stained, so he discarded it, put his own back on, then hunched his shoulders into the captain's coat. He pulled the tie from his hair and shook it free. He popped the captain's tricorn on his head, and its feather wafted as he turned to face me. This was a different Bartholomew Roberts. His time aboard ship had put health back in his cheeks. His dark, curly locks shone in the sun, and he stood resplendent in a red jacket and breeches, white stockings with a hat to match. He looked every inch the buccaneer. He looked every inch the pirate captain. "Now," he said, "we must go before Portuguese reinforcements arrive. We must get back to the Rover. I have an announcement to make there that I'd like you to witness." I thought I knew what it was, and I was surprised in one way. He was but a lowly deckhand after all, but unsurprised also because this was Roberts, the sage, and the tricks up his sleeve were never ending. Watch yourself, Kenway. He's dangerous. And sure enough, when we arrived at the Rover, where the men waited nervously for news of the expedition, he leapt up to a crate to command their attention. They goggled at him up there, the lowly deckhand, a new arrival on board to boot, now resplendent in the captain's clothes. In honest service there are thin commons, low wages, and hard labour. Yet, as gentlemen of fortune, we enjoy plenty and satisfaction, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. So what man with a sensible mind would choose the former life, when the only hazard we pirates run is a sour look from those without strength or splendour? Now, I have been among you 6 weeks, and in that time have adopted your outlook as my own, and with so fierce a conviction that it may frighten you to see your passions reflected from me in so stark a light. But, if it's a captain you see in me now, I'll be your bloody captain. You had to hand it to him, it was a rousing speech. In a few short sentences proclaiming his kinship, he had these men eating out of the palm of his hand. As the meeting broke up, I approached, deciding now was the time to make my play. I'm looking for the observatory, I told him. Folks say you're the only man that can find it. Folks are correct. He looked me up and down as if to confirm his impressions. Despite my distaste for your eagerness, I see in you a touch of untested genius. He held out his hand to shake. I'm Bartholomew Roberts. Edward. I've no secrets to share with you now, he told me. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. He was going to make me wait. 51. September 1719. Damn the man. Damn Roberts. He wanted me to wait 2 months. 2 whole months. Then meet him west of the Leeward Islands, east of Puerto Rico. With only his word to take for that, I sailed the Jackdaw back to San Inagua. There I rested the crew for a while, and we took prizes when we could, and my coffers swelled, and it was during that period, I think, that I cut off the nose of the ship's cook. And when we weren't taking prizes, and when I wasn't slicing off noses, I brooded at my homestead. I wrote letters to Caroline in which I assured her I would soon be returning as a man of wealth, and I fretted over the observatory, only too aware that with it lay all my hopes of a fortune, and it was built on nothing more than a promise from Bartholomew Roberts. And then what? To my one-track mind, the observatory was a place of enormous potential wealth. But even if I found it, even if Bart Roberts came good on his word, it remained a source of potential wealth. Wasn't it Edward who had scoffed at the very idea? Gold doubloons was what we wanted, he'd said. Perhaps he was right. Even if I found this amazing machine, how the bloody hell was I going to convert it into the wealth I hoped to acquire? After all, if there were riches to be made, then why hadn't Roberts made them? Because he has some other purpose. And I thought of my parents. My mind went back to the burning of our farmhouse, and I thought anew of striking a blow at the Templars, the secret society who used their influence and power to grind down anyone who displeased them, to exercise a grudge. I still had no idea exactly who was behind the burning of my farmhouse, or why. Was it a grudge against me for marrying Caroline and humiliating Matthew Haig? Or against my father, mere business rivalry? Probably both was my suspicion. Perhaps the Kenways, these arrivals from Wales, who had shamed them so, simply deserved to be taken down a peg or two. I would find out for sure, I decided. I would return to Bristol one day, and exact my revenge. And on that I brooded too. Until the day came in September when I gathered the crew, and we readied the Jackdaw, newly caulked, its masts and rigging repaired, its shrouds ready, its galley stocked, and the munitions at capacity, and we set sail for our appointment with Bartholomew Roberts. As I say, I don't think I ever truly knew what was on his mind. He had his own agenda and wasn't about to share it with me. What he did like to do, however, was keep me guessing, keep me hanging on. When we'd parted, he told me he had business to attend to, which I later found out involved taking his own crew back to Principe and exacting his revenge for the death of Captain Howell Davis on the people of the island. They'd attacked at night, put to the sword as many men as they could, and made off not only with as much treasure as they could carry, but the beginnings of Black Bart's fearsome reputation. Unknowable, brave and ruthless, and apt to carry off daring raids. The one we were about to carry out, for example. The one that began with Roberts insisting the Jackdaw join him on a jaunt around the coast of Brazil to the Todos os Santos Bay. We didn't have long to find out the reason why. A fleet of no fewer than 42 Portuguese merchant ships. What's more, with no navy escorts. Roberts lost no time in capturing one of the outlying vessels to hold talks with the captain. It wasn't something I got involved with, but from the bruised Portuguese naval officer, he'd learned that the flagship had on it a chest, a coffer that he told me contained crystal vials filled with blood. You may remember. Vials of blood. How could I forget? We anchored the Jackdaw, and I took Adewale and a skeleton crew to join Roberts on his purloined Portuguese vessel. Up to now, we'd remained at the fringes of the fleet, but now it seemed to split up, and we saw our chance. The flagship was testing her guns. Anchored some distance away, we watched, and Bartholomew looked at me. "Are you stealthy, Edward Kenway?" "That I am," I said. He looked over to the Portuguese galleon. It was anchored not far away from land, with most of the crew on the deck firing inland, carrying out exercises. Never was there a better time to steal aboard. So at a nod from Bart Roberts, I dived overboard and swam to the galleon on a mission of death. Shinning up a Jacob's ladder, I found myself on deck, where I moved quietly along the planks to the first man, engaged my blade, swept it quickly across his throat, then helped him to the deck and held my hand over his mouth while he died. All the time I kept my eyes on the lookouts and crow's nest above. I disposed of a second sentry the same way, then began scaling the rigging to the crow's nest. There, a lookout scanned the horizon, his spyglass moving from left to right, past Robert's ship and then back again. He focused on Robert's vessel. His gaze lingered on it, and I wondered if his suspicions were churning. Perhaps so. Perhaps he was wondering why the men on board didn't look like Portuguese merchants. He seemed to decide. He lowered the spyglass, and I could see his chest inflate as though he were about to call out, just as I sprang into the lookout position, grabbed his arm, and slid my blade into his armpit. I swept my other arm across his neck to silence any cries, as blood gushed from beneath his arm, and he breathed his last as I let him fall to the well of the crow's nest. Now Bart's ship came alongside, and as I descended the ratlines, the two ships bumped and his men began pouring over the sides. A hatch in the quarterdeck opened, and the Portuguese appeared, but they stood no chance. Their throats were cut, their bodies thrown overboard, and in a matter of a few bloody moments the galleon was controlled by Bart Roberts' men. Fat lot of good their gun training had done. Everything that could be pillaged was pillaged. A deckhand who dragged the coffer on deck and grinned at his captain, hoping for some words of praise, got none, Roberts ignoring him and indicating for the chest to be loaded on his stolen ship. Then, suddenly, came a shout from the lookouts. "Sail ho!" And in the next instant we were piling back to the stolen ship, some of the slow men even falling to the sea as Robert's ship pulled away from the flagship and we set sail, two Portuguese naval warships bearing down upon us. There was the pop of muskets, but they were too far away to do any damage. Thank God we were in a stolen Portuguese ship. They had no desire to fire their carriage guns at us. Not yet. Probably they hadn't worked it out yet. Probably they were still wondering what the bloody hell was going on. We came around the bay, sails pregnant with wind, men dashing below decks to man the guns. Ahead of us was anchored the Jackdaw, and I prayed that Adewale had ordered lookouts. I thanked God my quartermaster was an Adewale and not a Calico Jack, and so would have made sure the lookouts were posted. And I prayed that those lookouts would at this very moment be relaying the news that Roberts's vessel was speeding towards them, with the Portuguese navy in pursuit, and that they would be manning their positions and weighing anchor. They were. Even though we were being pursued, I still had time to admire what to my eyes is one of the most beautiful sights of the sea. The Jackdaw, men on its rigging, its sails unfurling gracefully, being secured, then blooming with a noise I could hear even from my vantage point far away. Still, our speed meant we caught them smartly, just as the Jackdaw was gaining speed herself, and after exchanging quick words with Roberts, I stood on the poop deck and my mind returned to the sight of Duncan Walpole, he who had begun this whole journey, as I leapt from the poop of Roberts' ship back onto the Jackdaw. "Ah, there's nothing like the hot winds of hell blowing in your face," I heard Roberts cry as I crouched and watched as our two vessels peeled apart. I gave orders to man the stern guns below. The Portuguese reluctance to open fire was over, but their hesitancy had cost them dear, for it was the Jackdaw who took first blood. I heard our stern guns boom, then spin back across the deck below. I saw hot metal speed over the face of the ocean and slam into the leading ship, saw splinters fly from jagged holes in the bow and along the hull, men and bits of men joining the debris already littering the sea. The bow gained wings of foam as it dipped, and I could imagine the scene below decks, men at the pumps, but the vessel already shipping too much water, and soon... She turned in the water, listing, her sails flattening. A cheer went up from my men, but from around her came the second ship, and that was when Bartholomew Roberts decided to test his own guns. His shot found its mark just as mine had, and once more we were treated to the sight of the Portuguese vessel ploughing on, even as the bowstring dipped and the bows sunk, her hull looking as though they had been the victim of a giant shark attack. Soon both ships were seriously floundering, the second one more badly damaged than the first, and boats were being launched, men were jumping over the side, and the Portuguese navy had, for the time being at least, forgotten about us. We sailed, celebrating for some hours until Roberts commanded both vessels drop anchor, and I stood alert on the quarterdeck wondering, what now? I'd primed my pistols, and my blade was at the ready, and via Adewale I'd told the crew that if there were any signs of a double cross, they were to fight to save themselves. Don't surrender to Roberts, no matter what. I'd seen how he treated those he considered his enemy. I'd seen how he treated his prisoners. Now, though, he called me across, having his men on the rack line swing me a line so that first I, then Adewale, could cross to his ship. I stood on the deck and faced him, a tension in the air so thick you could almost taste it, because if Roberts did plan to betray us, then now was the time. My hand flexed at my blade mechanism. Roberts, though, whatever he was planning, and it was safe to say that he was planning something, it wasn't for now. At a word from him, two of his crewmates came forward with the chest we had liberated from the Portuguese flagship. "Here's my prize," said Roberts, with his eyes on me. It was a coffer full of blood. That was what he had promised. Hardly the grand prize I was after, but we would see. We would see. The two hands set down the chest and opened it. As the crew gathered round to watch us, I was reminded of the day I had fought Blaney on the deck of Edward Thatcher's galleon. They did the same now. They clambered on the mast and in the rigging and stood on the gunwales in order to get a better look as their captain reached into the chest, picked out one of the vials, and examined it in the light. A murmur of disappointment ran around those watching. No gold for you, lads. No silver pieces of 8. Sorry. Just vials that probably to the untrained eye might have been wine, but that I knew were blood. Oblivious to his crew's disappointment, and no doubt uncaring of it anyway, Roberts was examining the vials, one by one. Ah, the Templars have been busy, I see. He replaced the vial with nimble fingers that danced over the glittering crystals as he picked out another one, held it up to the light, and examined it. Around us, the men, disconsolate with the turn of events, descended the ratlines, jumped down from the gunwales, and returned to their business. Roberts squinted as he held up yet another crystal. Lawrence Prince's blood, he said, and tossed it to me. Useless now. I stared carefully at it as Roberts cycled quickly through the contents of the coffer, calling out names. Woodes Rogers, Ben Hornigold, even Torres himself. Small quantities kept for a special purpose. Something to do with the observatory. But what? The time for taunting me with promises was over. I felt anger beginning to rise. Most of his men had gone back to work. The quartermaster and first mate stood nearby. But I had Adewale. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to show Bartholomew Roberts how serious I was. Maybe it was time to show him that I was sick and tired of being messed around. Maybe it was time to use my blade to insist he told me what I wanted. You must take me to the observatory, Roberts, I said firmly. I need to know what it is. Roberts twinkled. To what end, eh? Will you sell it from under my nose? Or work with me and use it to bolster our gains? Whatever improves my lot in life, I said guardedly. He closed the chest with a snap and placed both hands on the curved lid. How ridiculous! A merry life and a short life, that's my motto. It's all the optimism I can muster. He seemed to consider. I held my breath. Again that thought, what now? And then he looked at me, and the mischievous look in his eyes had departed. In its place, a blank stare. All right, Captain Kenway. You've earned a look. I smiled. At last. 52. Can you feel it, Adewale? I said to him, as we followed the rover around the coast of Brazil. We're moments away from the grandest prize of all. I feel nothing but hot wind in my ears, Captain, he said enigmatically, facing the wind, sipping at the breeze. I looked at him. Once again I felt almost overpowered with admiration for him. Here was a man who had probably saved my life on hundreds of occasions, and definitely saved my life on at least 3. Here was the most loyal, committed, and talented quartermaster a captain could ever have, who had escaped slavery, yet still had to deal with the jibes of common mutineers like Calico Jack, who thought themselves above him because of his colour. Here was a man who had overcome all the bilge life had thrown at him, and it was a lot of bilge, the kind that only a man sold as a slave will ever know. A man who stood by my side on the jackdaw day after day and demanded no great prizes, no rich-making haul, demanded little but the respect he deserved, enough of the shares to live on, a place to rest his head, and a meal made by a cook without a nose. And how had I repaid this man? By going on and on and on about the observatory, and still going on about it. Come on, man. When we take this treasure, we'll be set for life. All of us, 10 times over. He nodded. As you wish. By now the Jackdaw was not far from the Rover, and I looked across the deck to see their captain, just as he looked over to see me. "Ahoy, Roberts!" I called. "We'll cast anchor and meet ashore." "Here we're followed, Captain Kenway." "How long for, I wonder?" I snatched the spyglass from Adewale and scuttled up the ratlines, shouldering aside the lookout in the crow's nest and putting the spyglass to my eye. "What do you think that is, lad?" I snarled at the lookout. He was young as I was when I first joined the crew of the Emperor. "It's a ship, sir, but there are plenty of vessels in these waters, and I didn't think it close enough to raise the alarm." I snapped the glass shut and glared at him. "You didn't think at all, did you? That ship out there isn't any other ship, son. It's the Benjamin." The lad paled. "Aye, that's right, the Benjamin, captained by one Benjamin Hornigold. If they've not caught up with us, then it's because they haven't wanted to catch up with us." I began to make my way down the ratlines. "Call it then, lad," I shouted up to the lookout. "Sound the alarm, late as it is." "Sail ho!" The Cuban coastline was to our starboard, the Benjamin behind us. But now I was at the tiller, and I hauled her over, the rudder complaining as she turned, the men reaching for a handhold as our masts swung, our port side dipped, and we began to come around until the manoeuvre was complete, and the men were bitching and moaning as the oars were deployed, the sails reefed, and we began a trudge aimed at meeting the Benjamin head on. You won't be expecting that, will you, Benjamin? "Captain, think carefully about what you mean to do here," said Adewale. "What are you grousing about, Adewale? It's Ben Hornigold come to kill us out there." "Aye, and that traitor needs to die." "But what then? Can you say with certainty that you deserve the observatory more than he and his Templars?" "No, I can't, and I don't care to try. But if you've a better idea, by all means tell me." "Forget working with Roberts," he said with a sudden surge of passion, something I'd rarely seen from him. Such a cool head, usually. "Tell the assassins. Bring them here and let them protect the observatory." "Aye, I'll bring 'em here. If they're willing to pay me a good sum for it, I will." He made a disgusted noise and walked away. Ahead of us the Benjamin had turned. Hornigold with no stomach for a fight, it seemed, and we saw the men in her mast securing the sails. Oars appeared and were soon spanking the water, our two ships in a rowing race now. For long moments all I could hear was the shout of the coxswain, the creak of the ship, the splash of the sweepers in the water, as I stood at the bow of the Jackdaw and Hornigold stood at the stern of the Benjamin, and we stared at one another. As we raced, the sun dipped below the horizon, flickering orange, the last of its light as night fell and brought with it a wind from the northwest that dragged fog inland. The Benjamin anticipated the wind with more success than we did. The first we knew of it was seeing her sails unfurl, and she put distance between them and us. Some 15 minutes later it was dark, and fog billowed in towards that part of the Cuban coastline they call the Devil's Backbone, crags that looked like the spine of a giant behemoth, a moon giving the mist a ghostly glow. "We'll have a hard fight if Hornigold draws us any deeper into this fog," warned Adewale. That was Hornigold's plan, though, but he'd made a mistake, and a big mistake for such an experienced sailor. He found himself being hustled by the wind. It rushed in from the open sea, it charged at cross purposes along the coast, turning the sandbanks of the Devil's Backbone into a haze of impenetrable layers of fog and sand. "The winds are tossing them about like a toy," said Adewale. I pulled up the cowl of my robes against the chill wind which had just begun to assault us as we came within its range. "We can use that to get close." He looked at me. "If we are not dashed to pieces as well." Now the sails were rolled up again, but on the Benjamin they weren't so quick. They were being buffeted by the wind. I saw men trying to reef the sails but finding it tough in the conditions. One fell, his scream carried to us by the gusts. The Benjamin was in trouble. It bobbled on an increasingly choppy sea, buffeted by the wind that snatched at its sails, turning it first one way, then another. It veered close towards the banks of the Backbone. Men scurried about the decks, another was blown off board. They'd lost control, at the mercy of the elements now. I stood on the forecastle deck, one hand braced and the other held out, feeling the wind on my palm. I felt the pressure of the hidden blade on my forearm, and knew it would taste the blood of Hornigold before the night was old. "Can you do this, brother? Is your heart up to it?" Benjamin Hornigold, who had taught me so much about the ways of the sea. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had established, who had mentored my greatest friend Edward Thatch, who in turn had mentored me. Actually, I didn't know if I could. Truth be told, I was hoping the sea would swallow him up and see the job done for me, I told him. But I'll do what I must. My quartermaster. God bless my quartermaster. He knew the fate of the Benjamin before even the fates knew of the fate of the Benjamin. And as it crashed sidelong into a high bankside, seemingly wrenched from the sea by a gust of wind and spirited into a cloud of sand and fog, he saw to it that we drew alongside. We saw the shapes of crewmen tumbling from her top decks, figures indistinct in the murk. I stepped up to the gunwale of the forecastle deck, braced with one hand on the bowstrip, then used the sense, just as James Kidd had shown me. And among those falling bodies of men who slipped from the deck of the ship onto the boggy sandbanks and into the water, I was able to make out the form of Benjamin Hornigold. Over my shoulder I said, "I'll be coming back." And then I jumped. 53. The snap of muskets from the jackdaw began behind me as a one-sided battle between my ship and the crew of the now beached Benjamin. My senses had returned to normal, but Hornigold was doing me a favour, shouting encouragement and curses to his men. "Some mighty piss-poor sailing back there, lads, and if we live out this day, by God, I'm flaying every last bitch of you. Hold your ground and be ready for anything." And then I appeared from the mist on the bank nearby, and rather than heed his own words, he took to his heels, scrambling along to the top of the incline and then across it. My men had started to use mortars on the fleeing crew of the Benjamin, though, and I found myself placed in danger as they began raining onto the sand around me, until one exploded near Benjamin, and the next thing I knew he was disappearing out of sight over the other side of the sandbank, in a spray of blood and sand. I scrambled over the top, made hasty by my desire to see his fate, and paid for it with a sword swipe across my arm, opening a cut that bled. In a single movement I span, engaged the blade, and met his next attack, our steel sparking as it met. The force of his attack was enough to send me tumbling down the bank, and he came after me, launching himself from the slope with his cutlass swinging. I caught him on my boots and kicked him away, his sword point parting the air before my nose. Rolling, I pulled myself to my feet and scrambled after him, and again our blades met. For some moments we traded blows, and he was good, but he was hurt, and I was the younger man, and I was lit by vengeful fire, and so I cut his arm, his elbow, his shoulder, until he could hardly stand or raise his sword, and I finished him. "You could have been a man who stood for something true," he said as he died. His lips worked over the words carefully. His teeth were blood-stained. "But you've a killer's heart now." "Well, it's a damn sight better than what you have, Ben," I told him. "The heart of a traitor who thinks himself better than his mates. Aye, and proven true. What have you done since Nassau fell? Nothing but murder and mayhem." I lost my temper, rounded on him. "You threw in with the very kind we once hated," I shouted. No, he said. He reached to grab at me and make his point, but I angrily batted his hands away. These Templars are different. I wish you could see that. But if you continue on your present course, you'll find you're the only one left walking it, with the gallows at the end. That may be, I said, but now the world has one less snake in it, and that's enough for me. But he didn't hear me. He was already dead. 54. Is the pirate hunter dead? Said Bartholomew Roberts. I looked at him, Bartholomew Roberts, this unknowable character, a sage, a carpenter who had turned to a life of piracy. Was this the first time he'd visited the observatory? Why did he need me here? So many questions. Questions to which I knew I would never be given answers. We were at Long Bay, on the northern shores of Jamaica. He had been loading his pistols as I arrived. Then he asked his question, to which I replied, Aye, by my own hand. He nodded and went back to cleaning his pistols. I looked at him and found a sudden rage grip me. Why is it you alone can find what so many want? He chuckled. I was born with memories of this place. Memories of another time entirely, I think. Like another life I've already led. I shook my head and wondered whether I would ever be free of this mumbo-jumbo. Curse you for a lurch, man, and speak some sense. Not today. Nor any other day, I thought angrily, but before I could find a reply there came a noise from the jungle. Natives? Perhaps they'd been disturbed by the battle between the Jackdaw and the Benjamin. What remained of Hornigold's crew was being herded aboard the Jackdaw, and I had left my men to it. Deal with the prisoners and await my return shortly. I'd embarked on this meeting with Bartholomew Roberts alone. He gestured to me. After you, Captain. The path ahead is dangerous. With around a dozen of his men, we began to move through the jungle, beating a path through the undergrowth as we began to head upwards. I wondered whether I should be able to see it by now, this observatory. Weren't they great